talking again about sabbaticals. And today I want to look at why have sabbaticals. So some of you may think, even after everything we talk about, that we shouldn't have sabbaticals, and that's fine. We just want you to understand, the board and the pastors and me too, as the one teaching this, I want you to understand why I think sabbaticals are a good idea. Partly so you can understand why I think so, but partly so that even if you think we shouldn't have them, you'll understand what my reasons are and my concerns are, and you can maybe come up with an alternative that would work well. But anyway, it's just part of the conversation. So why have sabbaticals? Let me review what we talked about last week. First of all, does the Bible command that we have them? Absolutely not. Does the Bible forbid that we have them? No. So can we just do whatever we want? Well, we can do better than that. What we can do is seek to implement biblical principles. And so at least whatever we choose, we're doing it for the right reasons, and because we want to glorify God and because we're wanting to find ways to obey the Bible as fully as possible. Then we looked at this in Romans 14 last time. Talks about people who have different approaches to observing certain days and eating certain foods. And it says, he who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord, or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. So whether we have sabbaticals or don't have sabbaticals, God's concern for us, or not, I don't mean worry, I mean the thing he wants for us is that we would be doing it for him, that we'd be doing it because we're living for him, because it's the way that we're going to glorify him. And that's the fundamental attitude that I trust that we all have, even if we come to different opinions on this. And then I want you to remember from Acts 6 that the early church just invented an office when they needed one. So we have liberty to do whatever we think will help, as long as we are testing it against Scripture and trying to follow biblical principles as much as we can. All right, so why have sabbaticals? This is the reason that I think that is a good idea, and that the board thinks it's a good idea. Again, I'm totally open to you guys having other thoughts. One of the things I want to remind you of, by the way, in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk about some of the dangers of sabbaticals. Please email me any examples you have of that or any things you're concerned about at kevin.m.megill@svcc.edu. Okay, why have sabbaticals? I think there's 4 reasons that are important for me. 1, the need for rest. 2, the need for time alone with God. 3, a way to show honor to leaders. And 4, a response to current spiritual warfare. So let me talk about each of these in turn. First of all, the need for rest. The very term sabbatical comes from the word Sabbath, which is a Hebrew word which means to rest or to cease from exertion, to stop laboring. The Israelites, as you know, were commanded to have Sabbaths. They were commanded to have several types of Sabbaths. There were weekly Sabbaths. Once a week on the 7th day, Saturday, they were expected to stop working and rest. They were commanded to have yearly Sabbaths. There were various kinds of Sabbaths built into the festivals, into the Passover, into the Feast of Booths, into the Pentecost. They were commanded to have a 50-year Sabbath. Every 50 years, they were supposed to rest the land for a while, and other 7-year Sabbaths and so on. So there were lots of Sabbaths built into the Old Testament law. God organized and governed and regulated their places and their times. And part of regulating their times was to establish times of Sabbath. Now, the focus for the Sabbaths in the Old Testament weren't for worship. They weren't for getting with God directly. They were very specifically to stop work, to rest on the Sabbath. And rest was a really important idea. Okay, we are no longer under the law of the Sabbath. We do not have to respect one day above another. We don't have to do it on Sunday. We don't have to do it. We should gather for worship, but we don't have to honor one day above another. Romans 14 makes that clear. Colossians 2 makes that clear. It's not wrong to do that, but we don't have to do that. Matter of fact, in Hebrews, it says that Jesus is our Sabbath. So just like the Israelites would stop working and just trust God's provision on that 7th day. So when we come to Jesus, we stop working for our salvation, and we trust in Jesus' finished work to be our salvation. And so we are resting in him when we get saved. And that's the meaning of the most important meaning of the Sabbath for us today. We observe the Sabbath by resting in Jesus and in his finished work rather than trying to work for our own salvation. Nonetheless, there is a lot of practical wisdom in having a day of rest once a week. God set this up for the Israelites not just to teach an important lesson about Jesus, but because it was good for them to rest once a week, especially if you're it was good for them, and it was good for them to give that rest to their servants and their slaves as well. It's just part of the way that humans work better, because God knows how we're built and he knows what he created us for. And failing having a once a week Sabbath, there's wisdom in at least having other times of rest built into our schedules. So there's kind of a principle that having times of rest is important for us. And that's true, even if we're not under the law of the Sabbath. For me, the most important verse about this doesn't mention rest or Sabbath directly at all, but it says this: unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep. Now, the last line, he gives to his beloved even in his sleep, is literally, in the Hebrew, he gives to his beloved sleep. So this is what this is saying. First of all, if God is not in it, you're not going to make any real progress anyway. If the Lord doesn't build the house, you labor in vain who build it. If the Lord is building the house, he'll build it through those who labor. So we will work, but God will be behind it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. But if the Lord is guarding the city, then we can do the work we have in front of us with confidence that God is going to establish it and give us the success we need according to his own sovereign will. But then having said that the important thing is to know what God is in and what he's not, he then tells you something about what God is in and what he's not. He says it is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors. He's not saying you don't work. He's saying that you don't work to excess. That if you think, if I just work one extra hour, one extra bit, or just put a little bit more work in to the extent where it's no longer healthy for you. If you're rising up too early, retiring too late, and too painfully laboring to get bread, it's because you're not trusting that God is in it. You're not trusting that God will take care of you. You're not trusting that God will meet your needs. And so he says, if you find yourself driven to be a workaholic, driven to give everything, to just keep laboring, then you're missing something. You're busy building a house that God's not building. You're busy guarding a city that God's not guarding. This is so relevant today. So many of us get caught up in a kind of a hectic workaholic pace where we never take time for anything. And he's saying, if you do that, you've lost sight of what it is God is doing in your life. And he says, why? Because he gives to his beloved sleep. In other words, God has regulated our lives and planned our lives knowing that we are finite human beings. And he's built us so that we need rest. He's built us so that we need downtime. He has not built us to function all the time. And then he's given us downtime. There will be time to do what God is calling you to do without having to never get any rest. He gives you sleep, meaning he accomplishes enough for you that you don't need to go beyond this. What happens is we stop trusting God to do the part we can't do, and we feel more and more driven to do whatever we can to survive and get our desires accomplished. And God says, chill, relax, rest, work, but work the right amount. Don't work to excess. Don't become perfectionist and a workaholic. And to me, even though this doesn't address Sabbaths directly, even though it doesn't say the word Sabbath, it says the word sleep instead. This is very much the heartbeat behind recognizing the principle of rest in my life. It's not trying to be God. It's not trying to do everything. It's just saying God has created me finite and with weaknesses and with limitations, and I have to be at peace with that because God is also backing me up and helping in my life for the things that I can't accomplish on my own. Okay, so there's a general need for rest. Does that mean we have to have sabbaticals for pastors? Of course not. But one of the reasons that we can have sabbaticals for pastors is it's one way of helping pastors establish times of rest in their lives and in their careers. And so just like the Israelites had weekly Sabbaths and longer Sabbaths and so on, we have the board has and the pastors have a schedule where they try to take a weekly day of rest from their jobs. And then they have schedules where they have longer things like vacations. But then the sabbatical is a special case that happens once every 7 years. And just like they had special sabbaticals in the Old Testament, not because the Old Testament says you have to have these things, but because there's a principle of rest that we think this is one good way to try to implement that principle in our pastors' lives. Second, and this for me is the most important, although I don't think it's the most important for everybody else on the board, it's the need for time alone with God. My need for time alone with God, but more importantly, my pastor's need for time alone with God. I don't mean time just for rest. I mean time for prayer. I mean time to seek God for direction. Here's several examples where God took somebody and had them spend an extended period of time alone with him, seeking his direction. Moses in Exodus 24 talks about how he went up the mountain for 40 days. Now, did it take 40 days for God to write the 10 Commandments? No, but he wanted Moses to spend that 40 days with him, up away from the people, just with God. And then when Moses came down, his face was glowing. And he had been so much in the presence of God, it transformed him. That was part of what God wanted to do before he delivered the law to the people. He wanted him to spend extended time, Moses to spend extended time in the Lord's presence, really letting him transform him and fill him with his glory. And the same kind of thing, I think, applies sometimes for us. Elijah had a period of time where he was very depressed and discouraged. And the first thing God did was have him eat and then sleep. And then he had to take a long journey and get alone on his own and really sort of isolated him. And then in that time, he spoke to him. And he spoke to him not in the first place that Elijah was looking, in the storm and in the wind and the fire, but quietly and in a still small voice. And sometimes we, like Elijah, have been so overwhelmed, so discouraged, we've piled up so much weight from the ministry we were doing that we need time to get alone with God, not just to rest, but to seek him, to hear his voice again, to hear what he's directing us, and realize it's small and still, and we have to be quiet to get to it. We have to be alone to get to it. It takes solitude, it takes silence, it takes waiting. And we can't just simply, or else we end up following all the other voices, and we miss the thing God is trying to show us. Paul, we don't know anything about this time, but it's something that's easy to miss. You get the picture from reading Acts that Paul got saved one day and started preaching everywhere the next day and became a missionary. But there's a period of 3 years that he goes into the desert in Arabia and stays alone with God, and then comes back and begins to be in ministry, preaching to the apostle, preaching to the Gentiles and being an apostle. So we miss that because it doesn't talk much about it, but it does mention it in Galatians. God took Paul alone for a time before he started his ministry and said, you need to really spend time with me and get a lot of things straight here. Jesus, Luke 4, was just as he started his ministry, and he went into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted, it says, by Satan. But partly because this is something God was teaching him, humanly speaking. Jesus was God, but he was acting as a human, learning as a human would learn. And what those temptations are about, if you look at them, they're all the kinds of temptations that leaders are likely to have, that ministers of the gospel are likely to have. The stones being turned into bread is the temptation to take our ministry or our leadership and use it for our own, gratifying our own desires. The throwing yourself off the temple is the temptation to try to focus on spectacle and on where other people think we look supernatural enough or anointed enough. It's about letting go of that and just letting God deal with and use us however he chooses. And the last one about, I'll give you all the nations of the earth if you'll just worship me, is about the temptation to compromise and not follow God alone for the sake of a greater influence and a greater impact. And all of those things are things that leaders are tempted with. And Jesus, I think, partly as a model for us, but at least just because of where God had him. Jesus, even though he never fell into these temptations, before he started in a ministry, he spent 40 days thinking about and pondering what God was showing him about what his ministry would be. Then later in Luke 5:16 and 6:12, you see that Jesus frequently would slip away for a whole night to pray. That's not 3 months, but it's an extended period of time. He did that, for example, before he chose the apostles. So it was typical of Jesus that he would spend extended time alone with God. I will say, by the way, this has been essential in my own life at different times. There have been times when God brought me out of some place where I was really stuck spiritually, or prepared me to go forward somewhere spiritually by giving me a time where I could really seek him and focus on him and let go of all the things in my life and just focus on what God was showing me. I think this is even hinted at, perhaps. You may not. It may not be. You can decide for yourself. In Acts 6, the passage about choosing the deacons. Remember what the apostles said. They said, it is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. And then at the end, they said, you choose those people, but we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. So there was the ministry of the word, that they were preaching the gospel, the neglecting the word of God, that they were studying and preaching the gospel, but there's also devoting ourselves to prayer. And I don't think that just meant intercession. I meant that they wanted to stay as close to God as possible, be hearing from him very, very distinctly. So they knew what their calling was, so they knew what they should be preaching, so they knew what should be doing as leaders. And they said, it is so important to us to do that. We do not want to be distracted by that, to be busy waiting on tables and making sure that the business of the church runs properly. And I think churches have a tendency to make their pastors wait on tables, to make their pastors sort out the complaints from the Hellenistic Jews or whoever else. I think we have a tendency to say, if there's a problem in the church that's bugging me, the pastor should solve it. But we don't want the pastors only occupied with that, or maybe even at all occupied with that. We want them doing the prayer and the ministry of the word. We want them to be listening to God so that they can see what he's directing them. One way to do that is through a sabbatical. It's not the only way, but it's one way. This is something I want my pastors to do, not for their sake. This is not about them needing it, but for mine. I want my leaders to have times to take, it says times to take extended time. Sorry about that. To take extended times with God, waiting until all the expectations on them and all the weight and worries drop away and they can hear the voice of God. They can get alone with God and they can get renewal and revival, not just for their sake, but for mine. Their leadership will be so much more Holy Spirit directed and so much more anointed, if you will, and so much more what God wants to do through us if they have that time to do that. I don't want that means that I don't want sabbaticals to be vacations. I want sabbaticals to be seeking God and really spending time with him. But it also means I want them to have enough time. And if you've been in heavy ministry for a long time, I think 3 months is a good amount of time. You might think a much different amount, but that's something for us to figure out. But it needs to be enough time, and it needs to be free from distractions. So it can't be continue pastoring for a while, but just take a little bit off. It has to be no worries, nobody coming to you. Get alone with God where there's nothing else in the way, no other voices shouting over the still small voice of God, and you just hear what God is saying. This is my most important reason for sabbaticals. I think sabbaticals are scheduled times in which pastors get alone with God and get his direction for the congregation and for their own ministries. Okay. It's also a way to show honor to leaders. A lot of the board are thinking in these terms. Before I show this verse, let me just talk about, we understand this principle and really, really observe it at harvest time. I see that every October when we have Pastor Appreciation Month, so many people in the congregation pour out appreciation and support for our pastoral leaders. I think that is terrific. I just love the fact that our congregation thinks that way. This is just an extension of that idea. And I just want to point out verses that affirm this. It's biblical that we have that attitude every October. It's a very biblical thing that we do. So, for example, Hebrews 13 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. First of all, like what I was just saying, if we help our leaders to have joy in leading us, that's actually better for us. If they are finding fullness and fulfillment in helping lead us, that's better for us. Secondly, notice that's partly on us. It is not just up to them to have joy. It is up to us to be people who are fun to lead, easy to teach, easy to disciple. Not that we always will be, but we want to do the best we can. But I guess that's all I had to say about that one. Next, 1 Timothy 5. The elders, that's pastors, the elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. God is saying if they're doing a good job and leading you well, you need to reward that in a way which is showing them honor. And one way for me that we can do that is through sabbaticals. Third, 1 Corinthians 16, I urge you, brethren, he says, you know the household of Stephanas, that they were the first fruits of Achaia. That is the very first people converted in Achaia, in the area of Corinth. And they have devoted themselves for ministry to the saints. And he says, I urge you about them that you also be in subjection to such men and to everyone who helps in the work and labors. He says, look at the people who are working to serve you, working to take care of your souls, working to lead you, working to teach you the word. working to do those things, look at our pastors and see, are they doing those things? If they are, be in subjection to them. But behind this is also not just the subjection like a legalistic thing, but the honor, the sense of appreciation and working together for this. And then Galatians simply says the one who's taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches him. We're supposed to be willing to share whatever our pastoral leadership will need. If they're doing their good job of teaching us, we're supposed to be, in response, being very open and generous with what we have. And I think part of that is being willing to be generous for those 3 months of the sabbatical, even though, and not worry about, are we spending money for them if they're on sabbatical? But again, you can apply this in many different ways, even without a sabbatical. If you decide not to have sabbaticals, if you think we shouldn't, let's find ways to still show honor to our pastoral staff. An important balance here, by the way, just so that nobody takes this and goes away with it and doesn't have the other side. There are also a lot of verses warning leaders not to abuse their authority. So 1 Peter says, pastors, don't lord it over your congregation, but be examples and servants. Matthew 20 says, the Gentiles have leaders who abuse their authority and lord over everybody, but he says, for you, leaders are supposed to be servants. James 3 says, those who are the teachers and the leaders in a congregation are subject to more accountability before God, and he will hold them to a stricter standard. 1 Corinthians 11:20 speaks to a congregation and says, why are you letting these people abuse you and walk all over you with their leadership style? Don't do that. And Matthew 4, again, is those temptations about, is those 3 temptations of leaders that we've talked about before. All right, finally, discerning spiritual warfare. I believe that part of what we have to do as we make decisions as a church is to be aware of the times we live in and to be aware of the attack of the enemy in these times. So let me just throw you some things just to get you thinking about that. None of these verses prove we should have sabbaticals by any means. They're just thoughts that I've had about spiritual warfare as I've been thinking about it. First of all, there is, of course, this famous passage that we have spiritual warfare, that we have an enemy who's demonic, not just human. Not just circumstances, but there are demons involved in attacking us. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you'll be able to resist in the evil day and having done everything to stand firm. We are in the middle of a battle, and we need to recognize that we're in the middle of a battle, and that our pastors are right in the thick of that battle as well. And we need to be thinking about how to make them successful in that battle as well as ourselves. At the very end of this passage, it concludes this way. It says, with all prayer and petition at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. So you're supposed to be aware of the fact that the enemy is attacking all the saints so that we can be praying for them and even helping them out at times. But here it says praying for them. And certainly all the saints includes pastors, although it also includes the rest of the congregation. And then Paul says, in his own role as an apostle and as their leader, he says, pray on my behalf. Notice what he asked them to pray for. Ask them to pray for, that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel. He says, I'm trying to preach the gospel. Would you pray that I can preach it boldly? He says, for which I'm ambassador in chains, that in proclaiming it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. So part of the attack of Satan will be to try to shut down the preaching ministry, the prophetic ministry, in a sense, of our leaders, to get them not to speak boldly as they ought to speak. And so we need to be praying for that and recognize there will be spiritual attack against that. There'll be pushback that they'll get every time they preach the gospel. There'll be different kinds of things they get every time they try to move forward in a spiritual direction. Secondly, when we think about spiritual warfare, we need to be discerning. This is kind of an interesting passage. Paul speaks to the Corinthians about a man that they've put under church discipline, and now he's saying to them, make sure you forgive him and welcome him back. He says, one whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For indeed, what I have forgiven, if I've forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ. He says, I definitely forgive him, and I do it for your sake, because you need forgiveness of him. You need to be able to get back with him. Why? So that no advantage would be taken of us by Satan, for we're not ignorant of his schemes. Satan is trying to to sneak something up on this church. And he says, we're not ignorant of his schemes. We know the ways that Satan attacks. We know the kinds of things he does. We know how he uses unforgiveness to put a wedge between a congregation, people in a congregation. And he says, we know what to do because we're aware of his schemes. Part of fighting the spiritual battle is to be aware of the trickery of the enemy and to recognize the sins he's going to call us to right when they seem most natural. There's another passage that I've always loved. It's an obscure little verse in the Old Testament, which talks of the sons of Issachar, men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. So part of being wise is you will find sometimes people who have a good understanding of the seasons and the times, that every time is different. Every place is different. Every situation is a little different. And part of knowing the right thing to do is to be discerning about what the times are saying. And so the point of all this is, I believe, you don't have to agree with me on this, but I believe Satan is really launching an attack on local churches in the last few years. And I think that attack is specifically aimed, even more than that, at church leaders. If you just look at the last 30 years and the last 10 years and look at how many church leaders seemed really impregnable, completely solid, and yet they have fallen leader after leader. Well, those are the ones who fell. But even the ones who are doing fine are under pressure and attack, I think, far more than we understand. I think there's an actual physical, emotional difference when people are in pastoral leadership. I think sometimes it's circumstances, sometimes it's physical and human enemies. But I think there's even, you don't have to buy this, I think there's even I think Satan sends moods and depression and anxiety against, and intrusive thoughts against pastoral leadership in a way that's sort of unique to their position, because he wants to take out the leaders so he can take out the congregation. And I think this changes from time to time. And I think we are under an extremely intense time of spiritual attack in these days. And I want to strengthen us against that. I don't want to compare us to previous decades. I want to just say right now that's the need. And sabbaticals are not the only way we can do that, but they are one way to do that. So those are the things that the reasons I would support sabbaticals. If you don't think sabbaticals are the way to go, I hope that you see the need for those things and you'll be thinking of other ways that we can accomplish some of those same goals. What we're trying to do is find some way to apply various biblical principles to implement them, whatever the best way it is, whether it's sabbaticals or whether it's something else. But that's the case for sabbaticals. And I hope it's instructive and helpful for you, even if you think sabbaticals aren't the way to go. All right, I want to close with the thing I've been closing with recently. Point out Harvest Time's path for Christian growth. Not the only way to grow as a Christian, but Harvest Time is trying to provide a way for people to grow. And it's threefold. It involves three things. First of all, the Sunday morning worship services, which are one way to help you to grow in loving God, which is to gather together with other believers to worship, if this is something you're able to do. The second thing is life groups, which is becoming part of a community of disciples that know you well and you know them well. And again, there's many ways to do that, but one way is to take advantage of Harvest Time's life groups. And the third thing is Harvest Time serve teams, which is one way of taking advantage of those are something you can take advantage of to discover your calling to serve. So whether you, to serve others. So whether you are part of a serve team or just finding that calling within your own life, in your own home or work or wherever else, do look to discover your calling to serve others. How is God calling you to serve? And regardless, I'll see you next week and have a good week.